The morning Ida Baker counted her savings for the 47th time. She did it with her back turned to the window so nobody walking past the laundry on Copper Street could see her lips moving as she tallied the figures in her head. $11.62. That was everything she had in the world, pressed flat between the pages of her mother's old Bible, tucked beneath the loose floorboard at the foot of her cot. $11.62, and she needed at least 40 to buy a proper seat on the Southern Pacific Line heading east to San Antonio, where her cousin Vera had written to tell her there was honest seamstress work and a spare room with a door that locked. A door that locked sounded like the finest luxury Ida Baker had ever heard described. It was the spring of 1883 in Caldwell, Kansas, and Caldwell was a town that chewed people up and spit them out onto the prairie like watermelon seeds. It sat right on the cattle trail line, which meant it saw more than its share of drovers and gamblers and men who believed that the combination of trail dust and whiskey gave them the right to behave however they pleased. Ida had come to Caldwell 3 years prior, following her late husband Gerald, who had fancied himself a land speculator and died of a fever before he could speculate anything worth keeping. She had stayed because leaving cost money she did not have, and so she had taken in washing and ironing for the hotel and the 2 rooming houses, and she had saved every coin that didn't go toward flour and lamp oil, and she had kept her head down and her eyes forward. She was 26 years old, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. The laundry building smelled permanently of lye soap and steam, and the skin on Ida's hands was roughened and reddened from the washboards, but she kept them clean, and she kept herself neat, and she held her chin at an angle that dared anyone to pity her. She had dark brown hair that she coiled at the back of her neck each morning, gray eyes that people sometimes found unnerving because they were so direct, and a voice that was quieter than most people expected from a woman who stood 5 feet and 7 inches tall. She had learned that quiet voices made people lean in to hear you, and that was its own kind of power in a town that respected almost no power a woman could claim. She had not told a single soul in Caldwell that she was saving to leave. That was the kind of information that traveled, and information that traveled in a cattle town had a way of reaching people who would make her life harder out of spite or boredom or both. So it surprised her considerably on a warm Tuesday in April when Oscar Yates sat down across from her at Hennessy's lunch counter with his hat in his hands and said, quietly and without preamble, "I heard you're fixing to leave Caldwell." Ida set down her coffee cup with such deliberate steadiness that it made no sound against the counter at all. She turned to look at him. Oscar Yates was 29 years old, and he had worked the Rafter H Ranch south of town for going on 5 years. She knew him the way she knew most people in Caldwell, which was to say she had observed him from a careful distance and formed opinions she had never shared. He was a lean man, built long in the leg and wide in the shoulder, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that had a quality of stillness in them that she associated with men who had learned to wait. He wore his brown hair a little long under his hat, and his jaw carried a few days of dark stubble that he never seemed to let grow into a full beard or bother to shave entirely clean. He smelled of horses and open grass and something faintly like cedar, and he was, in Ida's private estimation, the most straightforwardly decent man she had encountered in Caldwell, which was not saying an enormous amount but was saying something real. He had tipped his hat to her every time they passed on the street for 3 years. He had carried her laundry basket to the hotel door once when she was struggling with the load and her hands were raw from a long morning's work, and he had not said anything that required an answer, just taken the weight from her without making her feel weak for needing the help. She had thought about that small gesture more times than she could account for. "I don't know where you heard that," she said, keeping her voice level. "From Maybelle Greer," Oscar said. He didn't sound apologetic about it. "She does your mending sometimes when your hands are too bad." Maybelle Greer was 62 years old, half-deaf, and the most thorough gossip in 4 counties. Ida filed that information away and kept her expression neutral. Maybelle talks, Ida said. She does, Oscar agreed. He turned his hat slowly in his hands, the brim passing through his fingers in a steady circuit. I just wanted to say before you go that I think this town will be worse without you in it. Ida looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to determine what angle he was working, what he wanted from the statement, and she found, to her own discomfort, that she could not find one. He was looking back at her with those still dark eyes, and he appeared to mean exactly what he had said and nothing more complicated. That is a kind thing to say, she told him. It's a true thing, he said. He stood, put his hat back on, and laid a coin on the counter for his coffee. That's all I came to say. Good morning, Miss Baker. He walked out of Hennessy's, and she sat very still for a moment, staring at the place where his coffee cup had been. She did not know what to do with that. So she went back to her laundry. But she thought about it in the way that a person thinks about a small stone that has gotten into their boot. It was not painful exactly, but it was present, and it changed the quality of her walking. The week that followed was an ordinary Caldwell week. The drovers from the Double T outfit came up the trail and made their customary noise, and Sheriff Pratt kept his customary hands-off approach to all of it until something broke or bled, and Ida washed shirts and pressed collars and hauled water and saved another $1.14, which brought her total to $12.76. She saw Oscar Yates twice that week, once from across the street, where he was loading grain sacks onto a wagon bed outside the feed store. Once at the dry goods counter, where they both happened to reach for a spool of brown thread at approximately the same moment, and their fingers came within half an inch of each other, and they both pulled back, and she bought the thread, and he bought nothing, and they said good afternoon to each other with a formality that felt more charged than it ought to have. She was doing her best not to think about him. She found she was not doing especially well at it. It was on a Friday evening, when she had finished her last delivery and the light was going golden and long across the flat Kansas plain, that she sat on the back step of the laundry and allowed herself to think honestly about her situation. The air smelled of grass and coming summer. Somewhere down the road, a fiddle was playing something fast and cheerful from inside one of the saloons, and the sound carried out across the open space and softened by the time it reached her. She was going to leave. She had a plan. She was going to keep washing and saving, and by midsummer she would have enough. And she would pack her 2 dresses and her mother's Bible and her good pair of boots, and she would get on that train and she would go east, and she would start over in a place where nobody knew her name or her business or the particular shade of loneliness she had been carrying for 3 years. That was a good plan. It was the right plan. She thought about Oscar Yates saying the town would be worse without her, and she thought that was probably the first thing any person had said to her in a long time that felt like it was said because it was true, rather than because they wanted something from her or wanted to make her feel a particular way for their own comfort. And she thought that was a strange and small and significant thing. She went inside before she could follow that thought anywhere useful. The following Monday brought a complication in the form of Roy Diggins, who ran the larger of the 2 rooming houses and who had been one of Ida's steadiest customers. He came to the laundry in the morning with his face arranged in the apologetic but firm expression of a man who had already made a decision and was now merely performing the courtesy of telling you about it. "Got my wife's niece coming to stay," he said. "She'll be doing the house laundry herself, as she needs the occupation. I'm sorry to say it, Miss Baker, but I won't be needing your service from here on." Ida stood with a stack of clean shirts in her arms and calculated what this meant. Roy Diggins's account was nearly a quarter of her weekly income. The loss of it was not small. "I understand," she said, because she did understand, even though she wished with some ferocity that his wife's niece had found a different occupation. After he left, she sat down on her work stool and looked at the floor for a moment. Then she picked up the shirts again and started folding them, because the shirts still needed folding regardless of what happened to Roy Diggins's niece, and there was no productive use in sitting. She would simply have to save more slowly, or find another customer. She put out the word quietly, through Maybelle Greer, because for all her faults Maybelle knew everyone in Caldwell and they all knew her, and within 2 days Ida had picked up the laundry account for Dr. Alderman's household, which was smaller but better than nothing. She adjusted her figures. Midsummer became late summer. Late summer was still summer. She could manage that. It was toward the end of April, on an evening when the wind was coming up hard from the south and carrying the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet, that Oscar Yates came to the laundry door for the first time. He had a bundle of shirts under his arm, which was a thin pretext, and they both understood it to be so, because there was a laundry service at the hotel that was closer to the Rafter H and that most of the ranch hands used. "I heard Roy Diggins dropped your account," he said when she opened the door. She looked at him. "News travels." "In Caldwell it does," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite apologetic but was not without feeling. He held out the bundle. "If it would help, I've got 5 other fellows at the Rafter H who could use their laundry done regular. I could send it in once a week." Ida looked at the bundle. She looked at him. She was trying very hard to be practical about this and to not assign meanings to things that perhaps had no particular meaning. "That would be 6 men's laundry," she said. "That's a fair amount of work." "It's a fair amount of payment," he said. "I'd make sure of it." She took the bundle. "Every Monday," she said, "and I need them back clean and pressed by Friday." "That's agreeable," he said. He didn't move immediately. The wind pushed against his coat, and he put one hand on his hat brim without any self-consciousness about it. "How are you keeping, Miss Baker?" The question was simple and direct, and she found it caught her slightly off guard, the way that simple direct questions sometimes do when you are used to people asking things with edges and angles to them. "I am keeping well enough," she said. "How are you keeping, Mr. Yates?" "Better than yesterday," he said. It was the kind of answer that invited a question, but he didn't seem to be waiting for one particularly. He just smiled, a slow, contained thing that started at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth, and touched the brim of his hat and left. Ida stood in the doorway with 6 men's shirts under her arm and the wind in her face, and something happening in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She named it trouble and went back to work. The Monday deliveries from the Rafter H became a fixture of her week, and it was Oscar who brought them himself rather than sending one of the other hands, and she noticed that but kept the noticing to herself. He always came in the late afternoon, when the light was going amber and the day's heat was losing its edge. He always had something to say, but never too much of it. He told her about the ranch work with a matter-of-fact plainness that she found restful, the way that people who are comfortable with themselves tend to fill a room with something restful rather than something effortful. He told her about a young horse that had taken a particular shine to following him around the corral, which he found both flattering and inconvenient. He told her that old Pete Reardon, one of the ranch's longtime hands, had won $20 off a car dealer from Wichita and donated the whole sum to the collection plate at the Methodist church the following Sunday, because he felt guilty about how he'd won it but not guilty enough to give it back to the dealer. He told her about riding the fence line in the early morning when the meadowlarks were calling and the dew was still heavy on the grass, and the way it looked out there when the sun was just beginning to clear the horizon. He never overstayed. He never pushed. He spoke to her like she was a person whose time mattered and whose company he valued specifically, not because she was a woman who happened to be present. Ida, in turn, told him things. Not much, not quickly, but things. Small truths she kept generally to herself. She told him that she had grown up in Tennessee and that she missed the way the hills looked in the fall with the leaves turning. She told him that she found the Kansas sky overwhelming in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, that it felt like being reminded you were small but not in a manner that made you feel insignificant, more in a manner that made the world feel very large and still possible. She told him that she had a talent for bread that was almost totally wasted in her current circumstances because she had no proper oven. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention, unhurried and genuine, and she found that she had begun to look forward to Monday afternoons in a way that surprised her, and that she examined with some suspicion, because she had not allowed herself to look forward to much in several years. In the middle of May, something happened that altered the landscape of Ida's planning in a significant and unwelcome way. She was walking back from a morning delivery to the hotel when she passed the alley beside the bank and heard voices raised in the particular register that precedes violence. She did not stop, because stopping in Caldwell was often inadvisable, but she slowed and she looked, and what she saw was Ned Caulfield, who ran a small holding on the edge of town, and who was known to have a temper that whiskey made considerably worse, backing a young woman named Clara Hobbs against the alley wall. Clara Hobbs was 17 years old and worked at Hennessy's counter, and was the kind of quiet, earnest girl who reminded Ida uncomfortably of herself at that age. What Ida did next was not something she had planned. She walked into the alley, set her laundry basket down on a crate, and said in a voice that was very clear and very steady, "Clara, I need your help with something at the laundry. Come with me right now." Ned Caulfield turned around with an expression of slow astonishment that suggested he was not accustomed to being interrupted by laundresses. "This is a private conversation," he said. "Clara," Ida said, not looking at Caulfield, keeping her eyes on the girl. "Come with me." Clara came. Ida walked her out of the alley and down the street without hurrying, because hurrying would have communicated fear, and she was not in the business of communicating fear to men like Ned Caulfield. Once they were around the corner and half a block away, Clara started crying with the sudden heaving release of someone who has been holding themselves together by an act of will. Ida let her cry for a moment and then said, "Come inside. I'll make you some tea." She did not have any tea, strictly speaking, but she had some dried chamomile that served the purpose, and she sat with Clara for an hour while the girl composed herself, and told Ida enough of the story for Ida to understand that Caulfield had been bothering Clara for some weeks, and that Clara was frightened and did not know what to do about it. "You could talk to Sheriff Pratt," Ida said, and immediately recognized the inadequacy of the suggestion because Sheriff Pratt was the kind of man who viewed complaints from women and young girls as an administrative inconvenience. "What would he do?" Clara said, and her voice was so honestly bewildered that it broke something in Ida's chest a little. "Not enough," Ida said honestly, "but it would be on record. That matters sometimes." She walked Clara back to Hennessy's and spoke quietly to the owner, Mr. Hennessy, who was a decent man by Caldwell standards, about keeping an eye out. He agreed. She did not know if it would be sufficient. She suspected it would not. That evening she sat on her cot and thought about Clara Hobbs, and she thought about how Caldwell chewed people up, and she thought about her $40 in San Antonio, and she felt something complicated and guilty that she could not entirely resolve by morning. It was Oscar who asked her about it, on the following Monday, because apparently he had heard about the alley incident from Pete Reardon, who had heard it from someone at Hennessy's. News traveled. "That took courage," he said. He said it the same way he said most things, without decoration, but it landed with more weight because of that. "It took common sense," Ida said. She was folding a shirt with more precision than it strictly required. Someone needed to intervene. "Most people don't when it's Caulfield," Oscar said. "He's got a mean streak and people know it." "Most people," Ida said, "have the luxury of not being Clara Hobbs." Oscar was quiet for a moment. "Has he bothered you, ever?" The question was careful, and the care in it was unmistakable. Ida looked up from the shirt. "Once," she said, "about 2 years ago. I told him if he came near my laundry again, I would put his shirts in the middle of Copper Street and let the horses and the cattle do to them what they would. He believed me." Oscar made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was something warm and involuntary. "I expect he did," he said. There was a pause. The afternoon light lay golden across the floor between them. "Why are you going?" he asked. He asked it simply, the way he asked most things, without leading up to it. Ida put the shirt down. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at most things. Because there's nothing to stay for, she said. Because I've been here 3 years and I've done nothing but work and save and watch the trains go through. And I am 26 years old and I would like to have a life before I am old enough that the distinction doesn't matter anymore. He absorbed that. He didn't argue with it or rush to comfort it or fill the silence with false reassurance. That makes sense, he said, and then very quietly, I'm sorry Caldwell hasn't given you more to want. The honesty of it was so complete that she didn't know what to say to it, so she said nothing, and after a moment he picked up the bundle of shirts she'd handed him and said good afternoon, and left. She stood in the middle of the laundry for a long time after that. She knew by then that what she felt when Oscar Yates walked into a room was not trouble, or not only trouble. It was something older and more insistent than trouble. It was the particular feeling of wanting something specific that you have been telling yourself you cannot have, a kind of ache with the clean edge of recognition to it. She had been there before, years ago, before Gerald and the failed speculation and the reddened hands. She knew the feeling well enough to know that it was real and that it was not going to be convenient. She kept saving. She kept folding laundry. She wrote to her cousin Vera and told her that she was still coming, but that it might be fall now rather than late summer, and Vera wrote back to say the room would be waiting. In June, the summer heat settled in over Caldwell with the particular intensity of a Kansas summer, which is not something a person from the hills of Tennessee ever fully adapts to. Ida worked with her door propped open and her hair pinned up off her neck and sweat along her spine by 9 in the morning. The cattle drives had been moving through steadily, and Caldwell had the smell of a trail town in full operation, which was not a pleasant smell but was the smell of money moving, and money moving kept her customer base in shirts that needed washing. She had $17.40 saved now. She had another 6 weeks in Vera's letter before the room situation might change. She was closer. She could feel the shape of it getting clearer. It was on a Saturday in late June that she overheard something she was not meant to hear. She was at the dry goods store, waiting for Mr. Pruitt to finish with the customer ahead of her, when 2 men came in whom she recognized as hands from the rafter H, not Oscar, but 2 others named Sam Tildy and Dutch Fremont, who were loud in the way that men are loud when they don't think anyone significant is listening. Yates put in his resignation at the rafter H, Sam Tildy said, not quietly. Told Hatcher he'd work through July and that was his last month. What for? Dutch Fremont said. Don't know. But he's been drawing most of his pay in cash lately rather than keeping his tab. Pete Reardon says he's got himself some kind of plan. Ida looked very carefully at the bolt of blue calico on the shelf in front of her and said nothing. Probably buying land, Dutch Fremont said. He's always been the type to want his own place. Maybe, Sam Tildy said. Or maybe it's about the Baker woman. There was a pause and then Dutch Fremont laughed and said something low that she couldn't hear. And then they were at the counter asking for tobacco and the moment passed. Ida bought her flour and her lamp oil and walked back to the laundry with her basket and stood in the middle of the room and thought about Oscar Yates drawing his pay in cash and what Sam Tildy had implied and what it might mean, and felt something very large and very frightening expanding in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it meant she was becoming as much of a gossip as Maybelle Greer. She told herself to mind her own business and her own savings and her own trajectory east. She was not entirely convincing even to herself. On the following Monday, Oscar came with the laundry as he always did. But this time he paused at the door and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You generally do," she said, which was the closest she came to teasing. He sat down on the wooden chair she kept near the door, the one customers sometimes used when they were waiting. He held his hat and turned it in his hands. "Do you like this work, the laundry?" She considered the question. "I like that it's mine," she said. "I like that it doesn't depend on anyone's goodwill to function. I do not particularly like the washboards. If you could do something different," he said, "what would it be?" She looked at him. "Is this a philosophical conversation, Mr. Yates?" "It might be." She sat down on her work stool and thought about the question honestly. "I was a decent cook before Gerald," she said. "Back in Tennessee, I cooked for the household and for church suppers, and people said I was gifted at it. I think I would like to have a kitchen, a real one with a proper range and room to work." She paused. "I used to think about having a boarding house that served proper meals, not the kind where the food is gray and indifferent. The kind where people came because it was the best meal they'd have all week." She stopped herself. She had not told anyone that, not ever, because it was the kind of dream that felt too specific and too personal to share with people who might accidentally diminish it. But Oscar was not looking at her with the expression of someone who was about to diminish anything. He was looking at her with an expression that she found difficult to classify, intent and careful, and something she might have called tender if she were in the habit of using that word, which she generally was not. "That's a fine dream," he said. It was said as a fact, not a comfort. "It's a dream for someone with a kitchen and capital," she said. "I have a washboard and 11 weeks of savings." He nodded slowly and looked at his hat brim. "Miss Baker," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about something, but not today. I need to have something settled first. Would you be willing to talk to me next Monday?" She studied him. Whatever was happening behind his eyes was real, and it was significant, and she could not determine what it was. "I'll be here," she said. "I generally am." He nodded again, stood, put his hat on. "I appreciate your patience," he said, which was a slightly formal thing to say and which she found, for reasons she could not articulate, very affecting. He left. She watched the door for a long moment after it closed. She did not sleep especially well that week. This was not entirely attributable to the heat. She thought, during the long warm nights when the town was audible through her window in its various nightly capacities, about what she was doing and what she wanted, and whether these were the same thing. She had spent 3 years being very clear about what she wanted, which was to leave, and she had let that clarity be a wall against everything she was not allowing herself to want, because wanting things that were uncertain was how people got hurt and how plans fell apart. Gerald had wanted things that were uncertain, and they had ended up in Caldwell. But Oscar Yates was not uncertain in the way that Gerald had been uncertain. Gerald's uncertainty had been about the world, about whether it would cooperate with his particular vision of himself. Oscar's quality was different. He was a man who had made his peace with uncertainty by becoming very certain about a small number of things, and then acting on those things with a steadiness that did not waver. She did not know what those things were. She was beginning to think she might be one of them. The thought was enormous, and she kept setting it down and then picking it up again. It was Clara Hobbs who, unexpectedly, gave her a different way of looking at it. Clara came by the laundry on Thursday with some mending, and while they sat together in the open doorway in the evening cool, Clara said out of nowhere, "Do you ever get lonely, Miss Baker?" "Yes," Ida said, because she respected the girl enough not to lie. "I do too," Clara said, "but I think there's a difference between being lonely because you're alone and being lonely because you're in the wrong place, and I think you might be the second kind." Ida looked at her. "That is a perceptive thing to say." "My mother used to say the only cure for the second kind was to find a place where you weren't wrong," Clara said simply. Ida thought about that for a long time after Clara left. She thought about the Monday deliveries and the amber afternoon light in Oscar's still dark eyes and the slow smile that started in their corners, and she thought about her dream of a kitchen and a table and meals that were not gray and indifferent, and she thought about the way Caldwell felt wrong to her and had always felt wrong, and she wondered, carefully and tentatively, whether what made Caldwell wrong was the town itself or whether it was the particular way she had been living in it. Monday arrived. Oscar came at the usual time, but he was different when he came through the door. Not nervous precisely, because nervous was not a quality she associated with him, but purposeful in a way that had more weight than usual. He had a leather satchel with him that he did not have ordinarily, and he set it on the table beside the laundry basket, and he stood with both hands resting on the table edge, and he looked at her with the directness that she had always found challenging because it demanded the same directness in return. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you say anything." "All right," she said. He drew a breath. "I've been at the Rafter H for 5 years. I've been saving my pay for most of that, not for any particular reason except that I was raised to save what you can against the time you need it. I've got a sum set aside that I haven't touched." He paused. "I heard that you're saving to leave, and I've thought about that for weeks, and I've come to a conclusion." He reached into the leather satchel and brought out a folded piece of paper which he set on the table between them. Ida did not touch it. She watched him. "There's a building on Elm Street," he said. "The old Dawson property. It's been sitting empty since Dawson died 2 winters ago, and his son in Topeka has been trying to sell it for 8 months. It's got a proper commercial kitchen in the back, and a large front room and 4 rooms upstairs and a good cellar. It needs work, but the structure is sound. I've spoken to Dawson's son. He'll sell it for $430, which includes the kitchen range, which is a good one." Ida was very still. "I have enough saved to buy it," Oscar said, "and to put some money toward the repairs it needs." He kept his eyes on her face. "I know this is not a small thing I'm saying. And I know you don't have reason to believe things from men who come through your door making promises. So I want to be clear about exactly what I'm saying and what I'm not saying." He picked up the paper and held it toward her. "This is a letter of intent from Dawson's son, already signed with the price confirmed. All it needs is a buyer's signature." She took it. She read it. It was exactly what he said it was. Her hands were steady. "What I'm proposing," Oscar said, and his voice was very deliberate, the way a careful man's voice gets when he is saying the most important thing he has said in a long time, "is that you use this building for the boarding house you want. The kind with a proper kitchen and good meals. I'll put in the money to buy it and fix it up. It would be yours to run, completely yours." He paused again. "And I would like, very much, for you to consider staying in Caldwell long enough to let me court you properly. Not because I'm buying your attention with a building, because I want to be very clear that those are two separate things. One does not depend on the other. The building is yours regardless. But I would like the chance to let you know me better, and to know you better, and to see if what I feel is something that could be something real between us." The room was very quiet. Outside, the street had its usual afternoon sounds, boot heels and hooves and someone calling a name 2 doors down. The light through the window was the warm amber of a June afternoon, and it lay across the table and across the paper in Ida's hands and across Oscar Yates' careful, honest face. Ida looked at the paper for a long moment. She looked at the figure written there, and she thought about $430, which was more money than she had ever seen attached to her name in any document, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had known primarily through Monday afternoon laundry deliveries had taken 5 years of careful savings and pointed them at her kitchen dream without being asked. "Oscar," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she could see that it registered. "Yes," he said. "Why?" She asked. It was a real question. She wanted a real answer. He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know, but because he was finding the right words. "Because," he said, "you are the most honestly living person I have met in Caldwell, maybe in any town. Because you do your work and you hold your head up, and you are kind to people who need it, and you don't make a performance of any of it. Because I have spent 3 years watching you walk down Copper Street with your laundry basket, and I have spent those years being too much of a coward to say directly that I think about you more than I think about almost anything else." He paused. "And because I don't want you to leave, and the only honest way I could find to say that was to give you a reason that wasn't just my wanting." Ida set the paper down on the table. She looked at her hands for a moment and then she looked at him. "I cannot accept the building as a gift," she said. "That is not something I am able to do." He started to say something and she held up one hand, which stopped him. "What I would accept," she said carefully, "is a business arrangement, a partnership with terms written down and fair on both sides. You put in the capital, I run the business. We agree on how the earnings are split until the initial investment is returned, and then we renegotiate from there. She looked at him steadily. "That is a transaction I can accept with my self-respect intact." He held her gaze. Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile but was in the family. "That's more than fair," he said. "As for the second thing you proposed," she said. "Yes," he said again. He was very still, the way he was still in the way that meant he was fully present and not guarding himself. "I have been very careful for a very long time," Ida said, "about wanting things that weren't certain. I think I may have been too careful or careful in the wrong direction." She drew a slow breath. "I would like to have dinner with you. At Hennessy's, where it is public and proper and Clara Hobbs can watch us from the counter and feel encouraged that decent things happen to people occasionally." The corners of her mouth moved towards something that was not her usual contained expression. "And after that I will decide about the rest of it." Oscar Yates smiled then, the full version, not the slow, contained corners of the eyes version, but the whole of it, and it rearranged his face into something that made her breath do something unsteady. "Friday evening," he said. "Friday evening," she agreed. He picked up his hat. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was now able to name, because she had seen its reflection in herself in the window glass this past week, quiet and warm and a little afraid and entirely determined. "Thank you, Miss Baker," he said. "Ida," she said. "If we're going to be business partners." "Ida," he said, and her name in his voice was different than she had expected. Fuller, like a word that had been waiting to be said correctly. He left, and she sat down on her work stool and put her hands flat on her knees and breath for a moment, and then she picked up the paper with Dawson's son's signature on it and read it through 3 more times, and the figure did not change, and the realness of it did not diminish. She did not sleep especially well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than before. Friday evening came and Ida wore her better dress, the dark blue one she had made herself from calico the summer before, and she put up her hair with more attention than she usually gave it. And she walked to Hennessy's at 6 o'clock in the long summer light and found Oscar already there, at a table rather than the counter, wearing a clean shirt that she recognized from the Rafter H laundry bundle, and that he had taken some trouble with. Clara Hobbs was at the counter, and she looked at the two of them and smiled with her whole face in a way that was so open and pleased that it was almost uncomfortable, except that Ida found she did not mind. They talked for 2 hours over coffee, and a meal that was adequate by Hennessy's unambitious standards, and what they talked about was everything and nothing in particular. The way that 2 people talk when they are using words to learn the shape of each other's company. Oscar told her about growing up in Missouri, the second of 4 boys, his father a blacksmith who had been meticulous and quiet, and his mother a woman who read every book she could get her hands on, and who had insisted that all 4 of her sons do the same. Ida told him about her own childhood in Tennessee, her mother's cooking and her father's stubbornness, and the way the mountains looked in winter, and the 6 years of her first marriage that had started with hope and narrowed steadily down to a single difficult path. He did not ask intrusive questions about Gerald. He received what she offered and did not push for more, and she found that restraint more intimate than most questions would have been. When they stepped out into the evening air, the light was gone, and the stars were thick over Caldwell, in the way that the Kansas sky allows for when you are willing to stand still and look up. They walked along Copper Street without particular destination, and their arms were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "I don't have another kind," he said. "The Rafter H laundry, the 6 shirts every Monday, that was not because you particularly needed my services." It was not precisely a question. He was quiet for a beat. "No," he said. "You were giving me a customer because you heard I'd lost Roy Diggins's account." "Yes." She considered this. "Did it occur to you that I might not have wanted that I might have found it condescending?" "It occurred to me," he said. "I decided to risk it. I was wrong to make that decision without asking you." The honesty of the admission was so clean that it forestalled the lecture she had half prepared. "You were," she said, but I accepted the shirts." "You did," he agreed. "And the quality of your shirts is actually quite poor," she said. "I suspect you've been washing them in cattle troughs." He laughed, and the sound of it, genuine and easy, went out into the warm night air, and she let herself smile at it. Not the contained, careful smile, but the real one, the one she didn't often use. "I probably have," he said. They stopped at the corner of Elm and Second, where the Dawson property stood behind its fence of weathered boards. She looked at it. It was bigger than she had imagined, with a wide front porch and tall windows on the upper floor, and even in the dark she could see that it had been a solid building once and would be again. "It's going to take work," she said. "I know that," he said. "I can do most of it myself, carpentry and basic repairs. The kitchen range needs a new flue pipe, but the range itself is in good order." She looked at it for a long time. She could see it, the way she could always see things she cared about, not in a vague, hopeful way, but in the specific visual way of a person who has planned something carefully. The front room with tables set proper, white cloths if she could manage it, good oil lamps, the smell of bread in the morning, coffee that was actually hot, a table where the miners and the ranch hands and the traveling merchants could sit down to a meal that someone had taken pride in. She could see it all, and it did not feel like a dream anymore. It felt like a blueprint. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. Let's draw up the terms," she said, "and let's go see Dawson's son." She could see, in the darkness, that smile again, the real one, and she thought with a certainty that surprised her by how uncomplicated it was that she wanted to keep seeing that smile for a long time. The following weeks were the busiest of Ida Baker's life in Caldwell, and they were the best kind of busy, the kind where the work has direction and the direction has meaning. They wrote out the terms together at Hennessy's counter on a Saturday morning, Oscar across from her with a pencil and a serious face, Ida with the paper and the figures she had already calculated in her head. He invested the purchase price and the materials. She invested her labor and her expertise and $11.62, which she insisted on contributing, because she was not going to begin a partnership with nothing at all on her side of the ledger. They agreed on a split of income that would return his capital within 3 years if things went reasonably, and then restructured to equal shares after that. He wrote it out, and she reviewed it, and they both signed it. And Mabel Greer witnessed it because she was sitting at the next table, and they both knew she would be invaluable as a legal witness precisely because she would repeat the contents to everyone in town within 48 hours, which would save them the trouble of explaining the arrangement themselves. They rode to Topeka on the train together to meet Dawson's son, which was a 2-day trip, and they stayed at separate boarding houses when they got there, because they were not yet anything that would make a single accommodation appropriate, and the distinction mattered to both of them in a way that neither had to explain to the other. The meeting with young Dawson was brief and businesslike. He was a pale man in a city suit who seemed relieved to be done with the property and asked no questions beyond what was required. The deed changed hands. Oscar counted the money, and Ida walked out of the Topeka land office holding a copy of the deed for a building on Elm Street in Caldwell, Kansas. She stood on the Topeka sidewalk and looked at the document and felt something very much like the reversal of 3 years of slow compression, as though a spring inside her that had been wound tightly was beginning, very carefully, to ease. Oscar came out of the office behind her and stood at her shoulder and looked at the deed with her. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like something real," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "That's what it should feel like." On the train back to Caldwell, sitting across from each other in the swaying car with the planes rolling past the window in the gold light of a July afternoon, they talked about the renovation plans. He had lists. She had lists. Their lists complemented each other in a way that was satisfying, and that suggested a compatibility of thinking that was more significant than the specifics of kitchen flue pipes and front room flooring. At some point the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when two people have set down the business of the day, and are simply in each other's company. She was looking out the window at the vast flat country, and he was watching her with an expression that she had learned by now to recognize, the one that was entirely unguarded in a way that he was not always unguarded. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone in Caldwell," she said, without turning from the window. He thought about it. "I wanted to be a school teacher when I was young," he said. "My mother made us all read and I liked books and I thought I would go to a college somewhere and then teach. But my father died when I was 16 and I was the oldest still at home and the ranch work was what was available." She turned to look at him. "Do you regret it?" "I used to," he said. "Now I think the things I've learned outdoors are things I wouldn't have learned in any classroom, and the things I missed I can still read for myself. But I would have been good at it, I think. Teaching." "You would have," she said, with a certainty she realized was based on evidence, on the way he listened and the way he asked questions and the way he made space for other people's ideas. "You absolutely would have." He looked at her for a moment and then said quietly, "What haven't you told anyone?" She thought about it honestly, turning back to the window. "That I haven't been sure for a long time whether I deserved good things," she said. "Not in a way that I dwelled on, but in a way that made me plan for leaving rather than staying. As though staying and hoping for good things was something I hadn't earned the right to." The train rocked gently. Outside, a hawk circled above a far field in the golden air. "You deserve good things," Oscar said. It was said without sentimentality, as a plain statement, the way he said plain things. She didn't say anything, but she felt the words settle somewhere that needed them. When the train pulled into Caldwell Station in the late afternoon, he helped her down from the car and they walked up the platform together, and then he stopped at the edge of the street and faced her in the slanting light. "Ida," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to hold your hand," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." It was the most deliberate and formal request for a simple thing she had ever been asked, and she found it perfect, because it meant nothing was assumed and everything was chosen, and chosen things were the only things worth having. "That is agreeable," she said. His hand was large and warm and roughened in the same way hers was, from outdoor work and weather, and it held hers with a steadiness that was not possessive but was entirely sure of itself. They walked up Copper Street in the late Caldwell sunlight, and several people saw them, and news traveled as it always did. Mabel Greer saw them from her porch and nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose gossip has produced exactly the intended result. The renovation of the Dawson building took 6 weeks. Oscar worked on it in the early mornings before the day's other work, and on his days off from the Rafter H, since he was still completing his last month there through July. Ida came every afternoon after her laundry work was done, and she learned quickly that he was genuinely skilled at carpentry, that the lists he made were accurate and his work was precise. They painted the front room together on a Sunday in late July, Oscar on the upper sections and Ida on the lower, and they talked the whole time, an easy, constant conversation that moved from the practical to the personal without seams. And by the time the front room was white and smelling of fresh paint, Ida understood something she had been slowly understanding for several weeks and now understood completely. She was in love with Oscar Yates. She was thoroughly, specifically, and inconveniently in love with him, and she was not frightened by it in the way she had expected to be frightened, because it felt less like falling and more like arriving, and arriving was something she had practiced with. She had not told him yet. She was waiting for the right moment, or perhaps she was enjoying, for a little while, the particular pleasure of certainty before language, the knowledge carried quietly and warmly inside you before you give it to the air. He told her first. It was an evening in early August, when the building was close to done, and the kitchen range was gleaming, and the upstairs rooms were swept, and the front room tables had arrived from the carpenter, and stood solid and real in the lamplight. They were standing in the kitchen after a long day, and Ida had made coffee on the new range as a kind of ceremony, and they were drinking it standing at the kitchen work table. And Oscar looked at her over his cup with that expression that she now knew the name of. "I love you," he said. I want you to know that clearly so there's no room for misunderstanding." She set down her cup. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And then, because he had given her directness and he deserved it back, "I love you too. I've known it for a while and I was waiting for the right moment, and this is it as much as any moment will be." The kitchen of the Dawson building, soon to be Baker and Yates' boarding house and dining room, was very quiet. The oil lamp on the work table threw a warm circle of light, and outside the August evening was cooling toward night, and in the distance the town of Caldwell made its various sounds. Oscar crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and she met him halfway, which was the only fair way to do it, and he put his hands on either side of her face with the same careful deliberateness with which he did all things, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like falling. It was exactly like arriving. They were married in October of 1883 in the Methodist Church on 2nd Street, with Reverend Dobbins officiating and Clara Hobbs standing as Ida's attendant and Pete Reardon standing as Oscar's best man, and Maybelle Greer sitting in the front pew looking as though she had personally arranged the entire enterprise, which she had not, but which nobody felt strongly enough about to argue with her. The boarding house opened 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday, with 8 tables in the front room, and a menu that Ida had written on a chalkboard in her careful hand. The first meal she served was a beef stew with good bread and apple pie that had a crust that people would subsequently describe to each other for months as something that had reformed their expectations of what a crust could be. By Thursday, she had more guests than tables, and by the end of the first week word had traveled the way that only genuinely excellent things travel in a cattle town, which is to say quickly, and with the evangelical fervor of people who feel they have discovered something. Oscar had taken a job with the town, negotiated by Sheriff Pratt, who had surprised everyone including himself by exhibiting practical good sense when it came to hiring a former ranch hand with a level head and an honest face for the role of deputy. It was steady work and it suited him, and it meant he was in Caldwell full-time and at home for meals, which was not irrelevant to a woman running a kitchen. He helped with the breakfast and dinner service when he could, and he was good at it, moving through the dining room with the same quiet competence he applied to everything, and the guests liked him in the way that people like someone who is reliably decent. The injustice that Caldwell carried was not invisible to either of them. It was a town built on cattle money, and cattle money was built on labor that was poorly paid and sometimes worse than poorly treated, and the trail hands who were Mexican or black who came through with the drovers were often turned away from the establishments that would have served their white counterparts without question. Ida and Oscar were not in the business of turning people away for reasons that had nothing to do with their ability to pay or their willingness to behave decently, and this was not a minor decision in Caldwell in 1883, and it cost them some customers who left with loud and ugly opinions, and it earned them others who came specifically because they had heard that Baker and Yates was the kind of place that treated a man like a man. There was an argument about it with old Cliff Mercer, who ran the saddlery next door, and who came over one morning in January of 1884 to express his view on the subject with a bluntness that bordered on threat. Oscar listened to him from behind the dining room counter with the stillness that Ida knew meant he was keeping his temper by an act of discipline, and when Mercer was finished, Oscar said, in his quietest voice, which was the most serious one, that what happened inside Baker and Yates was Baker and Yates' concern, and that if Mercer preferred to take his breakfast elsewhere, that was his right, and he wished him a good morning. Mercer left. He did not come back, and a week later a Comanche drover named Rogelio and 3 of his trail partners came in out of the cold and had the beef hash and 3 cups of coffee each, and left a generous tip, and Ida watched them go and felt something clear and straightforward, that this was the kind of place she had meant to build. The spring of 1884 brought a warming that felt personal, the way that springs do when you have come through a difficult winter, and emerged on the other side with things intact that you were not sure would survive. The dining room had developed a regular clientele that felt like community in a way that Ida had not anticipated, and that moved her considerably. There were the miners from the camp east of town who came on Saturday mornings and ate with the concentrated attention of men who had not had good food in a week. There was Dr. Alderman, who came every Wednesday for dinner, and who had begun leaving medical texts on the dining room table when he was done reading them, with the note that he thought Ida might find them interesting, which she did. There was a widow named Mrs. Ferris who had 3 children, and who could not always pay but who helped with the washing up when she came, and whom Ida had never once made to feel the difference. Oscar had proven an excellent deputy, which was something that Sheriff Pratt told him with a reluctance that suggested it cost him something personally to admit. The work kept him engaged, and he took it seriously, and the quality of his seriousness was the kind that made things incrementally better rather than simply enforcing the status quo. He had a particular talent for diffusing situations before they required force, which was a less dramatic talent than the alternative and therefore less noticed, but which Ida considered far more valuable. She told him so one evening in April when he came home from a shift looking tired and sat at the kitchen table while she was finishing the dinner service cleanup. She brought him coffee and a plate of the leftover roast and sat across from him. "Pratt said you handled the McAllister brothers tonight without a single shot fired," she said. "Or needed," he said, eating. "That is not nothing," she said, "in this town." He looked up at her with the expression that still, after 6 months of marriage, made something in her chest feel warm and full and somewhat astonished. "I know," he said. "It's just harder to feel the value of the things you prevent." "I'll feel it for you," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the kitchen of their boarding house in the lamplight with the sound of the spring night coming through the open window. And it was one of those moments that is not dramatic at all, but that you know even as you are inside it will be the kind you remember. In May of 1884, Ida told Oscar she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, early morning before the breakfast service, when they were alone and the bread was in the oven and the light was new through the east window. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, looking at him directly. He stood entirely still for approximately 3 seconds, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her with a care that was so deliberate and complete that she had to press her face into his shoulder for a moment because the fullness of it was almost too much for her usual composure to manage. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A lot," he said, "and very glad." Their son was born in December of 1884, in the upstairs room of the Dawson building, delivered by Dr. Alderman with Oscar present because Ida had asked him to be, and he had not needed to be asked twice. They named him Samuel, for Oscar's uncle who had been a good man, and for the pleasure of a name that was strong and straightforward. Samuel Yates came into the world with considerable volume and a full head of dark hair, and Oscar's expression of serious deliberateness already established on his face, and Ida looked at him and felt the full weight and strangeness of having made a person, and wept in the uncomplicated way of a woman who has earned her tears. Oscar held his son with the same careful deliberateness with which he held everything that mattered to him, and Ida watched him from the bed and thought about the Monday afternoon laundry deliveries, and the way none of this had been in any plan she had made for herself, and felt that the deviation from plan was the best thing that had ever happened to her. The boarding house continued through 1885 and into 1886 with a steadiness that was both satisfying and, to Ida's private surprise, occasionally exciting. She had expanded the menu as her confidence in the kitchen's capacity grew, and she had hired Clara Hobbs as a full-time serving girl after Clara's situation at Hennessy's had become unpleasant in ways related to Ned Caulfield's continued presence in the town and his continued poor behavior. Caulfield had been arrested twice by that point, once for a disturbance at the saloon, and once for something more serious involving a dispute over land that ended in the destruction of someone's fence line. And both times Oscar had been involved in the arrest with the calm efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the opportunity to put something right. Caulfield left Caldwell in the spring of 1886 after the second arrest resulted in a fine he could not pay, and a judge's strong suggestion that his welcome in Sumner County was expired. Clara Hobbs, when she heard the news, sat down at one of the dining room tables in the middle of the afternoon and cried with relief, and then immediately apologized for crying in the dining room. "This is your dining room too," Ida said. "You can cry in it when the occasion calls for it." That summer was a good summer, by any measure Ida could apply. Samuel was 18 months old and had his father's long legs and her gray eyes, and a personality that was purely his own, cheerful and curious and entirely unabashed about his opinions, which he expressed with great volume for a person of his size. Oscar had been offered the position of town marshal when Sheriff Pratt retired in June, and he had sat with Ida for a long evening discussing the implications before accepting, and she had told him honestly that she wanted him to take it because she could see it was what he was suited for, and suited things had a way of flourishing. Caldwell in 1886 was not the same town it had been when Ida arrived in 1880. The wildest years of the cattle trade were easing, the railroad had shifted some of the traffic patterns, and the town was in the strange transitional state of becoming something more settled and less volatile, which had both losses and gains to it. The men who had come for the chaos were beginning to drift elsewhere, and the people who were building something intended to last were becoming more visible. Ida looked at the dining room on a Saturday morning in July, when every table was full, and the bread was golden and Samuel was making his precarious walking rounds from chair leg to chair leg, while the regular customers watched him with the fond indulgence of people who have adopted a child as communal entertainment. And she thought about the $11.62 and the $40 she had been saving toward the Southern Pacific and the door in San Antonio that locked. She thought about the word leaving and how it had been the only word she had for wanting something better, when she had not yet been able to see that better could exist in the place where you already were, if the place was allowed to grow around you, and if you were allowed to grow inside it. She thought about Oscar bringing 6 shirts to her door and sitting in the chair near the entrance with his hat in his hands, and the paper from Dawson's Son with the figure that had changed everything, and the kitchen of this building smelling of fresh paint and coffee, and his hands on either side of her face with that absolute deliberateness. Clara came through the kitchen door with an empty coffee pot and stopped at Ida's shoulder and followed her gaze across the dining room. Samuel had reached Oscar's chair at the far corner table, where Oscar was sitting with a cup of coffee and a copy of the Caldwell Post, and completely pretending not to watch his son's progress with the attention of a man tracking something very important. Samuel got both hands on his father's boot and used it as an anchor to stand up straight and make a sound of triumph. Oscar looked down at him with the smile, the full one, that Ida had not gotten tired of in almost 3 years, and it made something warm and uncomplicated happen in her chest, the same thing it always made happen. "You're not going to San Antonio," Clara said beside her, with the complete confidence of a young woman who has been paying attention. "No," Ida said, "I'm not." The following autumn brought a second pregnancy that Ida approached with the experience of having done it before, and the calm of a woman who had learned that her body was more capable than she had given it credit for. The winter of 1887 was a cold one, and the boarding house was full most evenings, because Ida's kitchen had become the kind of destination that people chose deliberately over their alternatives, and the coal stove in the front room put out a warmth that was both physical and something harder to name. Oscar came home from his marshal's duties most evenings around 6, and he and Ida had developed the small particular routines of a life built together. The coffee shared at the kitchen table after the dinner service was done, the evening report that was less a formal accounting and more a companionable exchange of the day's events. The low-voiced conversation after Samuel was a sleep that ranged from practical to philosophical according to where they were. And the silences that were comfortable in the way that only long-tested silences can be. She told him once, on a January evening when the wind was hammering at the windows and the town was locked down in the particular grip of a Kansas winter, that she was grateful in a way that she was not sure she knew how to express. He was mending a piece of harness leather at the table by the lamp, and he looked up at her without putting the work down, which was the way he looked at things that deserved his full attention without ceremony. "You don't have to express it," he said. "I know it the same way you know mine." "That is true," she said, "but I want to say it anyway. I want to say that you gave me something I did not know how to find for myself, and that is not nothing. That is a very large something." He set down the harness. He looked at her with those still dark eyes that were not still when she was close enough to see them clearly, but were full of everything he felt without editorial, the love and the steadiness and the particular pleasure he took in her company that had never diminished, and that she thought, from the evidence available to her, had no intention of diminishing. "You gave yourself something," he said. "I just handed you the door." "You handed me the door," she agreed. "That was the essential part." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and the winter hammered at the windows, and the lamp made its warm circle, and Samuel was asleep upstairs under 2 quilts, and somewhere in the building the second child was gathering itself toward its spring arrival, and everything was exactly as accounted for, and nothing was left open to the cold. Their daughter came in April of 1887, and they named her Rose, for no particular literary reason, but because Oscar had said, holding his daughter for the first time, that she had the quality of something that had opened up, and Ida had thought about that and agreed, and Rose seemed the right word for something that had opened up. Rose had Ida's gray eyes and Oscar's long-legged look, and a temperament that was sunny and social in a way that was entirely her own, already evident at 2 weeks old by the way she tracked faces, and responded to voices with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Samuel, 20 months old and in possession of strong opinions about the household order, inspected his sister with the seriousness of a property assessor, and then sat down beside Ida on the bed, and patted the blanket near Rose's foot with a careful proprietary gesture that made both his parents have to look elsewhere for a moment. Caldwell in the late 1880s was a town that was settling into something, the way that frontier towns either do or do not, depending on the quality of the people who stay to do the settling. Ida and Oscar were among those people, and they were not the only ones. Clara Hobbs married a young schoolteacher named Abbott in the spring of 1888 and moved to a house on the east side of town and became Clara Abbott. But she still came to help with the Saturday breakfast service because she said it was the best part of her week, and Mr. Abbott had learned not to schedule anything to compete with it. Dr. Alderman retired, and a young doctor named Fletcher came to take his place, and Ida liked him immediately because he had strong opinions about the prevention of disease that were scientifically rigorous and very unfashionable, and he defended them with the cheerful combativeness of someone who expected to be argued with and found it entertaining. He became a regular at Wednesday dinners and argued with Oscar about municipal water policy with a vigor that enlivened the whole dining room. The boarding house expanded in 1889 when the building next door came available, and Oscar negotiated its purchase through the financial terms they had established in the original partnership, which had been renegotiated twice as the business grew. The expansion gave them a larger kitchen, a second dining room for larger parties, and 2 more upstairs rooms that they rented to the kind of long-term boarders who wanted a room with a window and access to Ida's meals, which was a considerably longer list of applicants than they had space for. Ida hired a cook's assistant, A young woman named Petra who had come to Caldwell with her family from New Mexico, and who had a gift for spice work that broadened the menu in directions Ida had not previously explored. They cooked together in the mornings with the windows open to the summer air, and traded knowledge the way that skilled people trade knowledge, without hierarchy, each one learning from the other. The evening that Samuel, age 5, sat at the kitchen table and announced in Oscar's deliberate way that he intended to become a cook when he grew up, Ida and Oscar looked at each other across the table with the particular parental exchange that contains a whole wordless conversation. And then Oscar said, very seriously, "That is an excellent ambition." And Samuel nodded with the satisfaction of a person whose ambitions have been respected. Rose, at 3, declared her own intention to be a horse, which was less practically achievable but equally enthusiastically respected. In the spring of 1890, Ida stood at the window of the expanded dining room on a morning in May and watched Caldwell wake up in the slanting early light. The street outside was the same street she had walked with her laundry basket for 3 years, counting coins and keeping her head down and measuring the distance to the Southern Pacific Depot. She knew every board in every building, every name above every door, every face that turned up at her tables week after week. She thought about the word home, which she had not used for any place in a very long time before this one. She thought about how it was not a word for a geography but for a web of things, the particular quality of light through your own window, the sound of your children's voices from the upstairs rooms, the man who came through your kitchen door every evening and made the room feel settled, the regulars who greeted you by name and knew your coffee preference and left money on the table that was too much because they wanted you to know they valued what you'd built. She had built something. Not alone, but built it truly, with her own hands and her own skill and her own stubbornness. And the partnership that had made it possible was a true partnership in every sense of the word, and she had never been made to feel that it was less than that. Oscar came into the kitchen behind her, and she heard him pour himself a cup of coffee and then come to stand beside her at the window, and she felt him there without turning, the warmth and the solidity of him, still present, still deliberate, still choosing her as clearly as he had chosen her the first time. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood together and watched the town wake up, and it was not San Antonio, and there was no locked door, and it was so much better than what she had been saving toward that the comparison seemed almost beside the point. She had been saving for a way out. What she had found, instead, was a way in, and it had turned out to be the destination she had not known she was navigating toward. She thought about $11.62, flat in a Bible beneath a loose floorboard, and she thought about the ledger on the office desk upstairs that showed a business prospering and a partnership that had returned its investment and then grown beyond it. And she thought about the 2 children sleeping upstairs, and the man beside her, and the bread she could smell beginning to do what good bread does in a good oven. And she felt the full weight of the life she had, and found it was not heavy at all. It was the opposite of heavy. It was the specific lightness of a person who has put down the things they were carrying, because they no longer need to carry them. Oscar put his arm around her shoulders, not an unfamiliar gesture after nearly 7 years, but one that remained, to her persistent pleasure, the kind of thing that registered as chosen rather than habitual. She leaned into it. "I was thinking," he said, "that we might take Samuel and Rose to Tennessee in the fall, let them see the mountains." She looked up at him. She had not said she wanted that. She had mentioned the Tennessee mountains exactly twice in his presence, once on the train to Topeka, and once on a random evening that she was not certain he would have remembered. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said, as though this were simply a fact about how he was made, which it was. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and looked back out at the street. "The fall light there, you said," he said, "with the leaves." "With the leaves," she agreed. "You've never seen anything like it." "I believe you," he said. The morning traffic was beginning on Copper Street. the first horses and wagons, the far sound of someone at the blacksmith's, the thin music of a town coming alive in its daily rhythms. Somewhere upstairs a voice, Samuel's, was raised in the tones of a 5-year-old who has decided the morning has arrived, and then Rose's answering voice, brighter and more social. Ida looked at it all, the morning and the street and the man beside her, and she let herself feel it without reservation, the fullness of it, the specific unguarded pleasure of a person who has come home. "The bread is almost ready," she said. "I know," he said. "It smells exactly right." She went to the oven, and he followed, and the morning opened up around them like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this, like a door that had always been there, waiting for the right person to find the courage to walk through it and stay.